Dropping a tray of champagne flutes in a billionaire's penthouse usually ended one of two ways: a lawsuit or a shallow grave. For Maggie Odum, it ended with the most dangerous man in Chicago crouching down to help her pick up the broken glass. Nobody lasted more than 10 days working for Roman Szabo. His last 3 housekeepers had quit without notice. One left a resignation letter that was just the word "no" written 11 times in increasingly large font. His head of household staff had described the job posting to Maggie as competitive compensation for someone with a high tolerance for silence and mild psychological terror. The agency had sent 6 women before her. Maggie was number 7, which her grandmother back in Gary, Indiana, would have called a lucky number. Maggie herself called it desperation. She was 26, round and soft in all the ways that Manhattan preferred its women not to be, with thick dark hair that never quite cooperated with whatever she tried to do with it, and a center of gravity that had been conspiring against her since approximately the 3rd grade. She wore a size 22 and bought her work uniforms 2 at a time from a discount site because she had a habit of destroying them in ways that defied reasonable explanation. She had once spilled an entire pot of soup on herself while it was still on the stove. She didn't fully understand the physics of how that had happened. Nobody did. The Szabo penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a glass and steel tower in River North. From the outside, it looked like the kind of building where hedge fund managers held meetings that quietly ruined small countries. From the inside, it was exactly that, with better furniture. Roman Szabo ran Szabo International, a shipping and logistics conglomerate with ports in 14 countries and a reputation for making regulatory problems disappear in ways that kept federal investigators up at night. He was 41, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved by someone with a grudge and a very sharp tool. He didn't smile. Not once in the 6 years his photograph had appeared in business publications. Not once in the surveillance footage Maggie definitely had not looked up on YouTube the night before her first shift. She told herself she'd looked him up for professional reasons. She lied to herself constantly. It was a survival mechanism. Her first morning, she arrived at 6:30 sharp, because the briefing document had specified no later than 6:45 in bold font with 2 asterisks. She took the service elevator, as instructed. She was carrying a tote bag stuffed with her own cleaning supplies because she didn't yet know where the supply closet was, and she refused to start her first day empty-handed. The tote bag was too heavy. The service elevator was too narrow. When the doors opened onto the kitchen level, Maggie stepped out at exactly the wrong angle, and her left shoulder caught the door frame, which swung her sideways, which sent the tote bag swinging, which knocked a full silver coffee service off the narrow utility shelf, positioned directly beside the elevator door. The crash was tremendous. Coffee, cream, sugar cubes, and one very surprised orchid in a ceramic pot hit the imported stone floor simultaneously. The orchid survived, the pot did not. Maggie stood in the wreckage, both hands pressed to her mouth, making a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated her feelings with remarkable precision. "Are you injured?" The voice came from the kitchen doorway, low, measured, with a slight trace of an Eastern European accent that Roman Szabo had apparently never bothered to sand down despite 30 years in the United States. He was standing there in a dark suit at 6:31 in the morning, holding a tablet, looking at her the way a person looks at a weather event they find mildly inconvenient. Maggie lowered her hands. "No, I'm so sorry. I'll replace all of this. I'll take it out of my first paycheck. I'll take it out of several paychecks." She looked at the orchid, which had somehow remained upright, its single bloom trembling gently in the aftermath. "I think the plant is okay." Roman looked at the orchid, then at her. "My last housekeeper was here for 4 days," he said. "She did not destroy anything." "I'll try to beat her record," Maggie said before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't a smile. It was the absence of a frown, which on Roman Szabo's face amounted to approximately the same thing. "Clean this up," he said. "Breakfast is at 7. Black coffee, no sugar, toast, no butter." He looked at her once more, the kind of look that catalogued information without passing obvious judgment, and walked back into his study. Maggie exhaled slowly. She looked down at the mess. The orchid looked back at her. "Don't tell anyone," she whispered to it, and got to work. She lasted the first week through a combination of competence, sheer stubbornness, and the grace of God. She was a genuinely good housekeeper, which surprised people who watched her navigate a room, because watching Maggie move through a space was like watching someone attempt a sobriety test in slow motion. She bumped into things. She tripped over her own feet, and occasionally over feet that weren't hers. She had once, memorably, walked into a door that she herself had left open. But she was meticulous. Her grandmother had taught her to clean the way some grandmothers taught their grandchildren to pray, with complete attention and no shortcuts. The Szabo penthouse was in better shape by Wednesday than it had been in months, according to Oksana, the cook, who had worked for Roman for 11 years, and had the quiet, resigned competence of someone who had made peace with the fact that her employer was probably going to die violently, and had decided to make very good food until that day arrived. Oksana liked Maggie immediately, which Maggie suspected had something to do with the fact that Maggie was the only person on staff who complimented her cooking with genuine enthusiasm rather than polite murmuring. "He is not what people say," Oksana told her on Thursday, sliding a plate of pierogi across the kitchen counter without being asked. "People say he is cold. He is not cold. He is careful." "He told me not to rearrange his study," Maggie said. "I rearranged his study." Oksana looked at her with an expression that suggested Maggie was either very brave or profoundly unaware of the situation she was in. Possibly both. "And?" Oksana said. "He stood in the doorway for a long time looking at it," Maggie said. Then he said, "The lamp is better here," and he left. Oksana stared at her. "In 11 years," she said slowly, "he has never said that to anyone." The men who came and went from the penthouse told a different story about Roman Szabo than the business press did. The business press talked about market disruption and vertical integration. The men who sat in Roman's private conference room at odd hours, speaking in low voices in Polish and Ukrainian, and occasionally in a clipped, abbreviated English that seemed designed to contain as little actual information as possible, told a story about something considerably more complicated. Maggie was not naive. She had grown up in Gary, Indiana, which had given her an excellent education in what organized crime looked like from the outside. She recognized the shape of it, the deference, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the locked cabinet in the study that she had absolutely not tried to open, not even a little. She told herself it was none of her business. She needed the money. Her mother's medication wasn't cheap, and neither was the studio apartment in Pilsen, where Maggie kept her books, and her sad little rubber plant, and the collection of mismatched mugs that were the only things she'd managed to keep through 3 moves in 2 years. She was not in a position to be choosy about her employer's extracurricular activities. It was on a Friday afternoon in her 3rd week that things changed, quietly and entirely without her permission. Roman had been in a meeting since noon. Maggie had been working her way through the upper level, changing linens, dusting the kind of surfaces that accumulated dust despite being touched by no one. She was coming down the main staircase with a bundle of bedding when she heard voices from the conference room, louder than usual, edged with something that was not quite anger, but was in the same neighborhood. She wasn't trying to listen, but the conference room door was not fully latched, and the bundle of bedding was heavy, and she paused on the staircase to redistribute the weight. And in that pause she heard a name, and a number, and the phrase "the Chicago arrangement," and something clicked into place in her head with the mechanical precision of a very expensive lock. She had balanced the household accounts 3 days ago. Roman had handed her a ledger and told her to reconcile it against the vendor invoices, a task she'd assumed was a test of her organizational skills. She'd done it in 2 hours because numbers were the one place in her life where nothing tripped her. And there had been an anomaly. A catering vendor billing monthly for events that Maggie had found no evidence of in the household calendar. 17 months of invoices. $92,000. She had noted it in the margin in pencil, the way her grandmother had taught her, query this, and then she had handed the ledger back and thought nothing more of it. Now, standing on the staircase with a bundle of sheets, she thought considerably more of it. Roman came out of the conference room at 4:30, his expression arranged in the careful neutrality that Maggie had come to recognize as his version of barely contained tension. He stopped when he saw her. She was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, the bedding folded beside her, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she had made herself because her feet hurt. "You're sitting on my stairs," he said. "My feet hurt," she said. "Also, I have a question about the household accounts." He looked at her for a long moment. The accounts, the catering invoices. From a company called Meridian Event Services. She looked into her mug. They've been billing monthly for 17 months. I can't find a single event that corresponds to any of those dates. I thought you should know in case someone is taking advantage. She paused. Of the accounting. Not of you specifically. I imagine it would be very difficult to take advantage of you specifically. Roman was very still. You found this. I noted it in pencil. It's probably nothing. It is not nothing. His voice had dropped. Not threatening. Something else. Maggie. She looked up. It was the first time he had used her first name. She had been Miss Odum for 3 weeks. Something in the shift of it landed in her chest and stayed there. That vendor is managed by someone in my organization, Roman said carefully. Someone who has been misrepresenting costs. Oh, she said. Well, that's a firing offense. Among other things, he said, in a tone that suggested the other things were significantly more severe than termination of employment. I can print the full reconciliation if it's useful, she said. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, as if he was recalibrating something. Yes, he said after a moment. Print it. She stood up, picked up the bedding, and climbed the stairs. At the top, she paused and looked back. Roman was still standing at the bottom of the staircase, watching her go. He looked, she thought, like a man who had just been handed something he didn't know he was missing. She went to print the reconciliation. She also ate 4 cookies from the kitchen while she waited, because the situation called for it. Things shifted after that Friday in the quiet, incremental way that things shift when neither party is willing to acknowledge they are shifting. Roman began leaving her small notes on the kitchen counter, not warm notes, not thank you or good work, just information. The east window in the library sticks. Use both hands, or Oksana is off Tuesdays. There is soup in the freezer. It was, Maggie understood, his version of conversation. She started leaving notes back, written in her large, slightly chaotic handwriting on the small notepad she kept in her apron. The stuck window opens fine if you accept that it's going to argue with you first. And I found soup. Also found what I think might be a second freezer behind the utility shelving. Is that intentional? His response, the next morning. Yes, do not open it. She did not open it. Probably. He noticed that she was always warm. It was a physical fact about her, the kind of inefficiency that her body had decided to commit to fully. She ran hot. In the penthouse, with its precise climate control and its floor-to-ceiling glass, she was always slightly flushed, always pressing the inside of her wrist to the cool stone of the countertops when she thought no one was watching. On a Wednesday in October, she arrived to find the thermostat in the service areas had been adjusted by 4 degrees. No note, no explanation. Just 4 degrees cooler, which was exactly right. She stood in the kitchen and felt something she had been trying very hard not to feel. Roman fired a man named Tesla the following week. Tesla was a mid-level logistics coordinator who handled the Chicago waterfront contracts, and he was fired at 10 in the morning in the conference room, which Maggie knew because she was vacuuming the hallway and she heard the tone of Roman's voice, and then she heard the door open and she saw Tesla walk past her with the expression of a man who had just learned that he had miscalculated something catastrophic. He did not look at her. He did not look at anything. He was simply gone by noon, his access badge deactivated, his desk cleared. She later learned from Oksana, who learned things the way water learned its way through stone, that Tesla had made a comment about Maggie in the break room. Something dismissive. Something about Roman's housekeeping choices being unusual. Something that Tesla had apparently thought was funny until Roman had heard about it through the elaborate and efficient information network that ran through his organization like a nervous system. Maggie sat with this information for a long time. She thought about the thermometer, the notes, the way Roman looked at her sometimes, when she was doing something ordinary, washing a window or sorting mail, as if she was the answer to a question he hadn't thought to ask yet. She thought about how every man she had been with had looked at her the way people looked at a clearance item. Acceptable if you weren't too fussy, convenient, temporary. Roman Szabo looked at her like she was the only thing in a room that wasn't trying to deceive him. She was in considerable trouble. The trouble arrived in a more literal form on a Tuesday in November. Roman had been in meetings all day about a contested port expansion in Milwaukee, a situation that had drawn the attention of a man named Creed, who ran a rival operation out of Detroit and had been making aggressive moves on the Chicago waterfront for 18 months. Maggie had heard the name in fragments. She had assembled the fragments into a picture she was not comfortable looking at directly. Creed was erratic in the way that made Roman's deliberate, controlled dangerousness seem almost reassuring by comparison. She had slipped out at 3 in the afternoon to get the specific brand of dish soap that Oksana refused to substitute, and which was only sold at a particular supply shop 6 blocks south. She had told no one because it was 6 blocks, and she was a grown woman who bought her own dish soap. And she did not yet understand how thoroughly Roman's world had recalibrated the risk assessment of a 6-block walk. She was 2 blocks from the building when the car pulled to the curb beside her. The window rolled down. A man she didn't recognize leaned out, sandy-haired, smiling in the way that people smile when the smile is a tool rather than an expression. "Maggie Odum," he said, pleasantly. "I clean his house," she said, and kept walking. The car kept pace. "That's what I heard. Get in the car, please." "I'm going to pass on that," she said. She was half a step past the car door when it opened. 2 men in dark jackets were faster than she expected. One caught her arm. She planted her feet, which was instinct, and 280 pounds of instinct is not nothing, and for a moment she made them genuinely work for it. She got one elbow free and caught the nearest man squarely in the solar plexus, with a force that surprised both of them. He folded. She lunged for the space he'd left, but the second man was bigger, and the third was already out of the car, and there were too many of them, and in the end it didn't matter how hard she made it, because 3 to 1 is not good math. They put a bag over her head. She memorized the turns anyway. Old habit. Her grandmother had said to always pay attention to where you were going. The bag came off in a large room that smelled like lake water and concrete, and the particular damp cold of a building that hadn't been heated in months. She was sitting in a metal folding chair in the center of the room, her wrists zip-tied to the armrests, which were bolted to the floor in a way that suggested this was not the first time this room had been used for this purpose. The sandy-haired man from the car was standing in front of her, and she could see now that he was in his mid-40s, well-dressed in an inexpensive way, with the kind of smile that had probably worked on people who didn't grow up paying close attention to men who smiled too easily. "Creed," she said. He looked briefly annoyed that she knew. "Smart girl, I listen," she said. "It's a professional hazard." Creed began walking a slow circle around her chair. "Here's my problem, Maggie. Roman Szabo is unmovable. I've tried money, I've tried threats. I've tried the legitimate channels, which, nobody actually uses, but I tried." He spread his hands, and then I started hearing things. About his housekeeper. About how he fired Tesla over her. About how he restructured the climate system in his service wing over her. He stopped in front of her. Roman Szabo does not restructure climate systems for people he doesn't care about. Maggie looked at him levelly. He's very particular about his building. Creed took out a phone. "I'm going to call him. You're going to say something so he knows you're here. And then Roman is going to make concessions he wouldn't otherwise make because of you." "He won't," Maggie said. "I am his housekeeper. I break things and I'm bad at stairs. He is not going to compromise a 20-year business empire over dish soap and note-leaving." Creed dialed anyway. It rang once. Roman picked up. His voice on speaker was absolutely flat, completely even. "Creed, Mr. Szabo, I have something of yours." A pause, 3 seconds. "If you have touched her," Roman said very quietly, "you should say goodbye to the people you love. You have about 40 minutes. Maggie inhaled. 40 minutes. "Roman," she said loudly, directing her voice at the phone. "Don't give him anything. I'm fine. I have zip ties and questionable upper body strength, and I'll figure something out. Don't you dare." Creed ended the call. He looked at her with an expression that was less confident than it had been 30 seconds ago. "He's bluffing," one of Creed's men said from the doorway. Maggie looked at the man and decided not to share her opinion on that. Creed left 2 guards in the room with her, one large man by the door, one smaller man near the windows, playing something on his phone with the sound on, which Maggie found obnoxious but useful because he wasn't paying attention to her. She had been paying attention to the chair since she'd sat in it. Metal frame, solid. But the armrests were bolted on with hardware she could feel with her fingertips, and one of the bolts on her right side had the specific looseness of metal that had been assembled and disassembled too many times. She could feel it, barely, but she could feel it. She began very quietly to work. The man by the door was watching his colleague's phone game. The man with the phone was watching the phone. Maggie worked her wrist rotation methodically, applying pressure in the one direction that gave her something. And she thought about her grandmother, who had always said that stubborn outlasted everything, that you didn't have to be fast or strong or perfect, you just had to keep going when everybody expected you to stop. The bolt gave, not completely, but enough. Enough that when she shifted her full weight to the right and wrenched her arm upward with everything she had, the armrest twisted, and the zip tie caught on the bent bracket and snapped, and her right hand was free. The man by the door looked up. Maggie stood, the chair still attached to her left wrist by the zip tie, swinging. She was not graceful about what happened next. Maggie Odum had never once in her life been graceful. But she was 280 pounds of cornered, furious woman who had been grabbed off a public street by men who thought she was leverage, and she swung that metal chair with everything she had. It caught the guard's forearm on his way across the room. He stumbled. She swung again and caught his knee, which buckled him. And then she was moving, and the second guard was coming up off the wall. But he'd been sitting, and she had momentum. And momentum was the one physical law that had always operated in her favor. She hit the door at full speed, which was not exactly her intention, but which had the effect of carrying her through it before the latch properly caught. And then she was in a hallway, and she turned left on pure instinct, and there was a door at the end, grey light underneath it. She got through it, into an alley. The cold November air hit her like a hand. She looked left, looked right, recognized nothing, then looked up and found a street sign at the corner. She oriented herself. She was 1.5 miles from the tower. She started walking, still dragging the chair armrest from her left wrist. She got half a block before she found a piece of rebar on the ground and used the corner of it to pry the remaining zip tie free. Her wrist was bruised, and she had a split on her palm from the metal edge, and she was wearing thin housekeeping flats in November, but she was walking. She was 3/4 of a mile out when the black SUV came around the corner. It stopped next to her before she could decide whether to run. The door opened. Roman stepped out. Behind him, Maggie could see Oksana's cousin, Gennady, who drove sometimes and whom, Maggie had suspected for several weeks, was something considerably more than a driver, and 2 other men she recognized from the penthouse's revolving population of quiet, serious visitors. Roman crossed the distance between them in 4 strides. He stopped directly in front of her and, for a moment, he just looked at her. The bruised wrist, the split palm, the chair bracket she was still holding because she had forgotten she was holding it. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. The careful neutrality was entirely gone. Underneath it was something that looked like a man who had spent 40 minutes not knowing if she was alive. "I got out," she said, because she felt she should open with this. "Before you got there. I got out myself." Roman reached out and took her hand. Very carefully, the bruised one, he turned it over. He looked at it for a long moment. "I got out myself," she said again, quieter. "I know," he said. He was still holding her hand. She let him. "Creed," she said. "Creed is handled," Roman said, in a tone that closed the subject entirely. She looked at her hand in his. His hands were large and warm, and had done things she was probably better off not thinking about in too much detail. Hers were round and slightly red from the cold, and there was still grease from the rebar under 2 of her fingernails. "I got the dish soap," she said. "When they grabbed me, I dropped it. It was the specific kind Oksana likes, and they don't have it anywhere else, and I'm very annoyed about that." Roman looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I will have it delivered. That seems like an overreaction. Maggie." She stopped. "I adjusted the thermostat," he said, "in a building that cost me $14 million to climate control, because you were warm." He said it quietly and with complete seriousness. "I fired a man I had worked with for 6 years because of the way he spoke about you. I have thought of 3 separate pretexts to walk through whatever room you are cleaning so that I could speak to you without it appearing that I wanted to speak to you." He paused. "I am not very good at this." "No," she agreed. "I am asking you to stay," he said. "Not as my housekeeper. What as?" He looked at her, and it was the look she had been cataloguing for weeks, the one that felt like being seen without subtraction. "As the person I would burn very many things to the ground to keep safe." Maggie exhaled. "That's not really a job title. I am open to suggestions." She looked at him for a long moment, at his careful face and his warm hands and the way he had come for 40 minutes, which in Chicago November traffic was no small thing. She thought about the notes on the counter, the thermostat, the orchid that had survived her first morning, still on the windowsill in the kitchen, because she had kept watering it, and because things that were stubborn enough sometimes made it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated, as if he was testing the weight of it. He put his coat around her shoulders, which she didn't argue with because it was November, and walked her back to the car. Gennady was looking very intently at the middle distance and pretending he had not witnessed any of this. The other 2 men were doing the same. Maggie respected the professionalism. The penthouse was the same when they got back. The orchid was on the windowsill. The study had the lamp where she had moved it 3 weeks ago. The thermostat was set exactly right. Oksana put pierogi on the table without being asked and left the kitchen without comment, which was her version of approval. Maggie sat down and ate, and Roman sat across from her and drank his black coffee and did not say very much, which was normal, except that now the silence between them had a different quality to it. Not empty, full. Later, Oksana would tell Gennady that she had known from the crashed coffee service on the first morning that some people walked into a space and rearranged it just by being there. That Roman Szabo had spent 15 years turning himself into something no one could touch. And then Maggie Odum had arrived and tripped over the threshold, and he had never quite put the walls back up. Maggie herself would have said it more simply. She had needed a job. She had done her work well. She had paid attention to numbers and to thermostats and to stuck windows, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, she had stopped feeling like the wrong size for every room she walked into, because one room, one very expensive and implausible room at the top of a tower in River North, had quietly rearranged itself around her. She still broke things, she always would, but in the Szabo penthouse, nobody kept score.